Welcome to Chapter 53, Population Ecology, where we discuss how groups of organisms are going to be able to interact to make sure that they can be successful, stay alive, and try to avoid calamity. Now, with this section, we're going to first pick up talking about just kind of, when we look at populations, how are we going to describe them? Like, how are we going to try and quantify what they look like, how they function? So starting off, we have this idea of density. So that's going to be how tightly packed the population is. So if you've got one set amount of space, and that was kind of, we'll just do two of them like that, you can see that you might have where both of these populations exist in the same space, but one of them might be where there's only a few. So for example, this could be something like the bear, like a large predator, where they need lots of space. Whereas if I look at something like mice or something, I mean, they might just be all over the flippin' place. The density would be much, much, much higher for that second population because they're smaller. So density is one characteristic that we'll use. And density is useful because it's very difficult to get a total count of organisms because you've got to try to track them all down. If they're very small, this can be essentially impossible. So if we know the rough density, then that makes it useful for us to try to come up with another way of counting how many organisms there are. Now, one way is to do a sample size where I say, all right, there's roughly this density per square mile. So maybe I take a smaller chunk, and this could be very small if it's like worms. It might be like 1 meter squared. And I'm going to go through and count up all the individuals of that particular species in that one area. I can then extrapolate my data based upon that one sample area and say, all right, if this is actually 1,000,000 times more area, I can just take 1,000,000 times the number that I counted in my one little sample size. And that way I can get a rough count of how many individuals are in that area. So that's a sample size estimate. You can also look at things like feces, marks that you have, dens. So sometimes you can use indirect indicators. This could even be things where you take like images with cameras and we try and extrapolate our data without actually capturing an animal. We can just look at some cases remnants. So it might be useful for birds, for instance, to go through after the fact and count up how many nests that you find. Maybe in the winter when the leaves are down from deciduous trees and you can see them clearly. And then you can say, well, there's roughly about 2 birds per nest, we'll assume. If we assume that some chicks survived, maybe you want to tweak it there. But you can come up with a figure by using those indirect indicators. And then lastly, a very common one is mark recapture, where I go through and capture a series of individuals. I then put some type of tag, like you can see the radio collar here. This one has an ear tag that they put on the tapir, I believe it is. And so we're going to mark them in some way, and then later on we'll capture a similar number typically and figure out how many of that number have the tag. We can then use this to extrapolate. So if I catch 20 individuals and tag them, then I re-catch 20 individuals and 4 of them are tagged. Then I can say, well, all right, the individuals I tagged represent about 20% of the population. 4 is about 20% of 20. And so I could say I'll take then the individuals that I captured and times that by 5, because it's 20%, that's a fifth. And so I could say there's probably about 100 individuals in that one particular population just by using that kind of basic math idea. Now, all these are going to be estimates. The only way to know for sure would be to have a small enough area or a big enough organism that we could like mark all of them, or where it's like a plains or something where we can get high enough above them to see them all to count them one by one. But that's going to be very difficult for us to do in most situations in nature. Now the other way to describe a population is dispersion. Now this is going to be how they're spread out. So this is not the same thing as count, this is not the same thing as density. So with this, there's 3 ways you can normally be. So the first one would be random. So this is where there doesn't seem to be much of a pattern. They can be kind of clumped up in some areas perhaps, spread out in others. It just seems like they kind of are where they are. And so that would be like this first one here where there doesn't seem to be a huge semblance of order going on. That can be because some things are spread by wind, various currents. And so if they're pretty hardy and they can grow in a lot of places if they just get there, you have something random that's getting them there, like the wind or perhaps some of the air currents, air currents or like water currents, ocean currents, etc. So if you're in an area where those can kind of switch around quite a bit, you can get this random dispersal. Now next you have clumped, which is probably the most common. And so this is where you'll tend to find them in groups. And these groups might be around where a copse of trees is. It might be around where a food source is. It could be like along a river or a source of water, especially if it's certain types of plants that need this. So this is very common that you'll see things grouped like this. The last type is uniform, which works with a lot of territorial animals. It also works with some like larger plants like trees where they just take up a certain amount of space. So you're going to see the trees naturally end up as they get older and mature, spaced out by a certain margin, just because that's how much the alpha tree, if you will, takes up, and everybody below him gets killed from a lack of sunlight, or at least can't grow properly. So uniform dispersion will exist, and it doesn't mean it's perfect rows, but you do tend to get a pretty even dispersion of the organisms within that area. Now, demography. So this is going to be population statistics. When we're looking at trends, we're looking at these characteristics we've been talking about of a population. So some of the important terms that we'll see. Birth rate, sometimes called natality, is just going to be usually it's per 1,000 individuals, how many people are going to be born each year. So if I have 1,000 individuals to start with, how many of them will give birth? Now for death rate, this is going to be of that same 1,000, how many of them over usually a year is the time span, how many of them will die. And then if we put these two together, you can start to get a rough sense of growth. Now age structure is useful to kind of figure out where a population is going. So if you stack things up by age and you look at how many individuals there are in each of these age groups, you can get a good sense of the health of that population. If that population looks more pyramid shaped, if it's got a lot of young individuals, that means it's going to be in a period of rapid growth. If you see the population's more like an inverted pyramid, that usually means the population's in decline because you have a lot of older people but not many reproductive and pre-reproductive people, so the population's likely to shrink as time goes on. And then you'll get many that are fairly stable, which is usually a little bit, going down as you go up because some people die off. But overall, it's going to be fairly vertical. Tends to be a pretty stable population that you'll see, especially amongst humans. Different animals, based upon when they tend to die, you'll see these can fluctuate a bit. But depending on what species you're looking at, you can still, once again, have a set shape that shows you it's likely growing, it's likely dying off, or it's pretty much holding steady. Now, survivorship curves, these will be tied more to your strategy. Some organisms are type 1 organisms, this is like us, where we tend to really take care of our offspring, so really old age tends to be what kills you. Or it could be disease and such, but it tends to be later on in life. So most individuals nowadays that are humans are going to make it through to adulthood. And so that's very type 1. Most individuals will make it to maturity. With type 2, this is where you have pretty much the same odds of dying throughout the course of your life. So songbirds are commonly put in this category because they can get killed when they're young, but they're also a smaller bird. So there are plenty of mammals, reptiles, and even larger birds that can kill them even when they're older. So the danger for them is just kind of constant. It's not like they're really, really likely to die any one given day, but they're not really likely to die one day more than the other. And then type 3 survivorship curve is where you typically don't take care of your kids at all. So this one, you're just on your own. These two, you tend to see more parental care. But these last ones are just like, look at me, I had 10,000 kids. I guarantee you're not going to be able to kill them all. So a lot of them die. You might have in some cases 99.9% of them die. Huge, massive die-off. So you see that this just plunges at the start. But once most of them make it, your chances of dying after you've kind of hit maturity are much, much lower. So this would be like certain sea turtles would fall into this group because they have that mass die-off as they first are born, but then once they make it, they have a pretty good chance of living day to day. Frogs and some other amphibians are like this. Some insects fall into this category, but these are just going to be ones that tend to die when they're young. That's the highest risk for them. Now, life history strategies. This ties into what we just talked about. So there's two common strategies that you'll see, but they're on a spectrum. So when we look at this spectrum, you're going to see you have R selected on one end, and then on the other end, you've got K selected. Now, an ultra R selected is going to be one that's going to be very, very much like a type 3 typically. Whereas the ultra K selected is going to be much more like a type 1 survivorship curve that we were just talking about. So these aphids here, where you can see there's lots of them, they have very short lifespans, they reproduce in huge amounts, but they also get eaten in huge amounts. This is very R-selected, and something like a blue whale will be very K-selected. These are things that tend to live long lives. Not much messes with them. They invest a lot of care into the few young that they have. And I'll describe the opportunistic and equilibrial in a second here. So, R-selected, these guys are going to be considered opportunistic because they have short lifespan, but they produce many, many, many offspring. These guys reproduce like crazy. So in the right conditions, they can reproduce very rapidly because there's so many offspring. If a lot of them survive, the population is growing like crazy. And we're going to measure that growth in something called a lowercase r. That's going to be the growth rate. So their r value can go ridiculously high. This can be huge. And so if times are good, their population explodes. Now, if times are bad though, their population can crash. So for them to have this explosive population growth, they're going to reproduce a ton of offspring. They're not going to take care of them because they can't. They produce too many. Their lifespan is typically not going to be very long. They're going to invest heavily in reproduction. So they're going to reach maturity, invest a lot in reproduction, and oftentimes die right after. That was their major thing. And they tend to get killed a lot. These individuals don't tend to live and die from old age, years from now. If they do die from old age, it's like 2 months from now. Their lifespans burn bright, live fast, and hopefully produce a lot of young. So these do great in opportunistic environments where there might be one season where things are great. And so during that season, they just go gangbusters and there's ridiculous numbers, but then they die off, so there's very few in the meantime. Or in other environments where like you've got a puddle where you've got to take advantage of it, and so you can rapidly take advantage of that puddle because it won't last long. That's that opportunistic idea. These are going to be living in uncertain areas typically, not stable environments. Now in stable environments, you select for what we call K-selected. K refers to a carrying capacity, which is the max something can handle in an environment of a particular organism. So K-selected organisms do well in stable environments. We call them equilibrial because they tend to kind of produce as many individuals as it can stand in that environment and then kind of hang out at that number. So these guys live long lifespans. All right, these are long-lived, older organisms where you'll see they're, in some cases decades or hundreds of years old. They tend to reproduce much fewer individuals, and it takes them a lot longer to reach maturity to where they can reproduce individuals, like humans. You can have like flies that might be reproducing in a couple weeks, whereas for humans you might be talking 16 years before you're capable of reproducing. They will have multiple reproductions oftentimes during their lifespan, but the individual reproductive events tend to be smaller as well. So they might have 1 child or 10 children, a litter, but they're not saying like, look at me, I just laid 1,000 eggs, which is the much more R-selected type idea. And they tend to take care of their kids. So you'll see we do this, elephants do this, birds do this. You tend to say I'm going to have few kids, but I'm going to really focus on them. So you're worried about quality versus R-selected is all about quantity. I'm not going to worry so much about each individual one making it, but I'm going to have so many that some of them will by default. It's like saying my way of playing darts is that I bought 1,000 darts, and so I just kind of randomly, blindly throw them at the wall. But I'm throwing so many of them, a couple will be bullseyes. Versus with the K-selected strategy, I'm really focused on each one, so I might only have 10 darts, but I'm really trying to focus to make sure some of those land in the bullseyes, so at the end I still get the same kind of result. I still get where several of my offspring make it. And so to do this though, you need a low death rate. If you have a really high death rate, where each individual has like, a 0.1% chance of living, having this long lifespan with few offspring is likely going to make you go extinct. So these guys will tend to be ones that don't have to fear day-to-day death as much, at least, as an R-selected organism.